So hello everybody, my name is Safia. You can find me as Captain Safia on Twitter and GitHub, and my website is safia.rocks, which is an amazing top-level domain. Although people think I'm a bit full of myself for having it, I'm not, trust me. So this talk, or this tutorial slot, is going to be a little bit interesting because it's a 45-minute tutorial slot, which is the shortest one of the day. And so in a lot of ways, it's going to be like a talk. And like most talks, it's going to be very focused on the slides. And I've made the slides available to you at this bit.ly link. If you go to bit.ly/PDC Jupy Kernels, you will find the Google slides for this presentation. You can download them, read through them, all that fun stuff. And with that being said, if you came here for the Popping Kernels talk, you are in the right place, and I am the right person. And stay in this room, please, for a little bit longer. We're going to be talking about a couple of things today, and I just want to give you a rundown of what you're getting yourself into over the next 45 minutes. So we're going to start off by talking about what kernels are and why they're important in the Jupyter ecosystem. And then once we've established understanding of that, we're going to talk about the Jupyter messaging protocol, which makes messaging possible and is really the crux of these kernels. And so once we've talked about that, we're going to talk about how we can build our own kernels by leveraging the Jupyter messaging protocol. And then at the end, I've prepared a quick exercise notebook that goes through how you build your own kernel so that you can go through the process yourself, practice a bit, and then take what you learned and like do something awesome with it, because that's the goal of this. So I want to start off by posing a really simple question, which is, what is a kernel? And there's a variety of definitions for what a kernel is, depending on the context of computing that you're working in. In this particular case, we're going to keep a pretty textbook-style definition of what a kernel is. We're going to define a kernel as a program that runs and introspects user code. So in Jupyter, kernels are in charge of keeping things like the execution state. And you see this in that little number on the side of your cells in Jupyter that represents when you've most recently run a cell or what order you've run it in. It keeps track of the output that cells should be returning or commands should be returning. It tracks the state of the kernel itself. So is this kernel alive? Is it dead? Has it not been responding for a while? And the kernel accepts, processes, and sends messages, essentially. It's really a communicator. And more importantly, a single kernel can be connected to multiple front ends. So I can have my Jupyter notebook and my Jupyter console connected to the same kernel with the same context. So really, a kernel is a messenger. It manages state, and it manages program output. And so what happens when you go on your machine and you're really excited to do data science or research or whatever it is that you do, and you type in Jupyter notebook on your terminal? Well, what happens is Jupyter is going to start a kernel and create what's known as a connection file. And a connection file is really just a simple JSON document that contains some information about how a front end, in this case your web-based notebook, can communicate with the kernel. And once that connection has been established via the information found in the connection file, all that happens is the front end and the notebook, the front end and the kernel communicate with each other via JSON messages. It's just JSON back and forth, hopping back and forth. Requests, responses, it's like one really long chat. Now, you're probably thinking the connection file seems to be like the start of this process. Like, it's how front end and kernel meet. Like, you know how there's when Harry met Sally? When front end met kernel is made possible by the connection file. So what does a connection file look like? What kind of information does it have that makes this connection possible? So it looks like this. Ugh, kind of scary. We'll dive through it together. So you'll notice that one of the parameters that's provided is an IP and several different ports that comprise the different sockets of your kernel And we're going to go through what those are and what they're responsible for in a little bit. And you'll notice that you have a key and signature scheme field. And those are designed to secure communication between a kernel that you started so that other users don't have access to that kernel and have the ability to execute code on it that you might not want them to. And that's pretty much the crux of it. So really what you want to focus on is those multiple ports. So you've got the control port, the shell port, the standard input port, the HP port, and the IO pub port. And we're going to dive into those in just a second. So I'm going to keep you on the edge of your seats until I have a big reveal where I go through it all. All good? So the next thing that's kind of really mysterious is how do you go about writing a kernel? Because remember I mentioned earlier that a kernel is a program, and you write programs using programming languages and all that fancy stuff. So there's two ways to write a kernel for the JavaScript or the Jupyter ecosystem. The first way is writing the kernel in Python itself. So one of the Jupyter libraries that's included is called IPyKernel. IPyKernel exposes a base class called kernel base that you can subclass that provides you all of the functionality that you need to override standard kernel functions. This might seem great, like, whoa, I can write a kernel for any language in Python, like I don't have to learn R to build a kernel for R because R syntax is gross because somebody decided that their assignment operator would be an arrow. That was not, no. It might jive with some people, it doesn't jive with me. So the only caveat there is that if you want to write your kernels in Python, there has to be a REPL, some sort of REPL console system for the language that you want to write the kernel in, and you're going to communicate with that REPL and send messages to it using pexpect. And pexpect is a Python library that's used to launch child processes and communicate with them. So for example, if I was trying to build a Ruby kernel, I would launch the IRB process, which is Ruby's interactive console, and send messages back and forth to that and have it doing the actual execution. So that's how you write kernels in Python. And that's what we're going to be doing later on in our quick little exercise. So you guys are going to get really comfortable and get your hands dirty with that. And then there's another way to write kernels that's a bit more involved, so we're not going to be covering it in the later half of the tutorial. And that's if you want to write the kernel in the native language. So let's say that you're writing a kernel for Ruby again. If you were to write a kernel in the native language, you'd be taking advantage of a networking library and communicating with all of those sockets at their appropriate ports that were mentioned earlier. You would have to manage sending messages back and forth yourself. You would have to do a lot of dirty work. I think that building kernels in the native language is a great way to learn that language because it helps you get in touch with a lot of really advanced concepts in the language, like networking or data structures. So I've been programming for a while, and I'm at that point where Intro to Go or Intro to Julia books are no longer appealing because they're so simplistic and they cover a lot of the basics. This is a great exercise if you're an existing programmer and you want to gain knowledge in a new programming language, but take the advanced route. You can always have a stab at building a kernel for Jupyter in that language. So that's a fun challenge for you if you're ever bored and curious on a Sunday night, as many of us are, I'm sure. And so with that, we've kind of covered what a kernel is, which is essentially a program that messages through a front end using ports specified in a connection file. Now I want to talk about what kind of messaging happens, what kind of messages are exchanged between the front end and the kernel to make all the cool stuff that is Jupyter happen. And this protocol is known as the Jupyter Messaging Protocol. It's really like a good name, which you don't find a lot in computer science. You usually find not good names. But so when I find a good one, I get really excited about it. And the Jupyter messaging protocol, like any messaging protocol, basically defines the specification for how messages are going to look when they are sent from the front end to the kernel through those ports, and when they're sent from the kernel to the front end through those same ports. So it's just a spec. And it looks something like this. This is the message structure of a traditional Jupyter messaging protocol message. You're going to start off, it's a JSON payload. It contains a header. It contains a parent header, which references data from the previously called command. It contains some metadata, so maybe perhaps the time the message was sent, the user it was sent by. If you're building a kernel, in the metadata, you would have some kind of like kernel-specific things that you might want to keep track of. And it also contains the content of the message, which is itself another dictionary or JSON payload. And so there's the basic structure. And there's different kinds of messages that are sent in this basic structure. And what that means is that for a given message that looks like this, you're going to have different values in the content key. And the value of those values is going to depend on which socket it's sent through. So remember when we looked back at that connection file and there were those different ports? So you had your standard in, you had like a HP port, you had like a shell port, all of that good stuff. These ports are going to come in handy when we talk about the different types of kernel sockets that exist. So I'm going to list them all out here, and then we're going to go through them one by one, talk about what they do, talk about how they're implemented a little bit, and then talk about how they are useful to you as a Jupyter user, like how they're manifested in your daily use of the program. So the first type of socket is the shell socket. You remember we saw the shell port in our connection file. The second type of socket is the I/O publication socket, which is named much better than the shell socket. So you have a standard input socket, you have a control socket, and you have a heartbeat socket. So all of these, if you recall the connection file, were referenced as ports in the connection file. So we have a way to communicate with all of these when our connection file is created when we instantiate a Jupyter Notebook instance. All right, let's start off by discussing the shell socket. So the shell socket is really responsible for managing communication with all of the front ends. The room just got really bright because of this like very bright meme. It's just flooded with light on all your faces. So it's responsible with communicating with all of the front ends. And it does this using a request-reply pattern. So what happens is we've got a front end and it sits there. And it wants something done, so it's going to package a message in that format that I showed you earlier, and it's going to send it through that port to the socket. The socket's going to through the socket to the kernel. The kernel is going to parse that message, try and understand what the user is asking for and what they want, and send a response back via a JSON payload that contains its response. So it looks something like this. So here's something really common that happens whenever you use the Jupyter Notebook, tab complete. If you want to check if a particular statement that the user has written is complete or not, that's something that the kernel is responsible for. The front end can't do that independently. So what you do is you might send a message that looks like this. You've got your header, which contains some information about the session, the date that it was sent, the version of the messaging protocol. You've got your metadata. And in your content, you have the code that you want to check if it's complete. In this case, we've got an incomplete print statement. So you send this over through the socket port, through the shell port to the kernel. The kernel looks at it, says, okay, the user wants me to check if this message is complete. Let me go ahead and do that really quickly. So it does that, and it sends back to you a response. The response looks pretty much the same, except you'll notice that the content has changed. Instead, now the content says that the status of the status is incomplete, referencing that incomplete print statement that you sent earlier. And this is really useful if you're doing something on the front end, like say you want to have a bright red color flash whenever somebody's got an incomplete statement in their notebook, or like you want to like rickroll them if they've got like an incomplete print statement. You could use this specification to do that. So again, the shell socket is based on request and response. And so you're probably wondering, what can this help us do in our day-to-day Jupyter use, in addition to checking if a statement is complete? Well, there's a lot of other ways that it's used. So tap complete is another way that you can use it. If you want to get information about the kernel that you're connected to, you know, what's the name of my kernel, what language is it in, what version. If you want to send out a request to the kernel to execute a chunk of code, like say you've got a complete print statement and you want to tell the kernel, all right, take care of this for me, send me back the response. All of this is done by the shell socket. It does a lot of the heavy lifting. For those of you who might go on after this and start to develop your own Jupyter kernels, the shell socket's probably one of the more complex ones to build, in my opinion. The next socket that we're going to talk about is the I/O publication socket. You got a sneak peek of my GIF there because my hands were a bit quick, but I like to think of the I/O publication socket as the announcer in the family. And the socket essentially publishes data streams to standard outputs and returns payloads that contain information about HTML or images that need to be rendered. So for example, if you've ever had to render like a matplotlib graph or any kind of image when you're using the Jupyter Notebook, the I/O publication socket's helping you out with that. So give it a thank you next time. Not that it doesn't have feelings, it's like not a human, so maybe don't. So what else does it help us do? Well, it helps us do things like keep track of the current kernel state, which is good to know. You want to know that your kernel is alive and well. It streams outputs that are like consequences of execution, like plots or renders. And the next socket that we're going to talk about is like really humble and self-explanatory and timeless, which makes it great, which is the standard input socket. And you're really going to need this when you have a situation where the kernel is going to want to request input from the front end. So for example, perhaps you want to execute a Jupyter cell that contains Python code that uses raw input to ask for input from the user. The standard input socket is going to be used in that case. And then the second socket, or the fourth socket, getting ahead of myself there, is the control socket. And the control socket is like the muscle of the socket family. It's the big gun. And it can basically do everything that the shell socket can do with one additional caveat, which is that it's a completely separate socket and it can trump things in the queue. So for example, when you have like, not that this has ever happened to me, but say like you're playing around with scikit-learn and you start training a model and you realize one of your parameters is off and you want to like quickly, like, you know, stop that cell, interrupt the kernel, and restart all over again. All of that is handled by the control socket because you want your interrupt the kernel message to take priority over that ongoing, you know, command where you're running code that contains model training or model fitting. And then the last socket is really simple to understand and unique in its own way, but very critical to the kernel ecosystem. And it's the heartbeat socket. And so I mentioned that all of the messages that we've been sending have been JSON messages, so you're sending Python dictionaries. The heartbeat socket is really special. Instead of sending JSON, it sends a simple byte string back and forth between the front end and the kernel. And as the name might suggest, it's used to keep track of the kernel to make sure that it's still open and alive. So if you're using the Notebook web app, you might notice on the side there's that indicator that says, kernel running, there's a green button, your kernel's all well, you like panic a little when it's red. All that is being taken care of by the information that's sent from the heartbeat socket. So those are your 5 sockets. These all make the magic happen. And they're all implemented on that standard sending back and forth of JSON messages, and really an agreement on what messages look like and how responses to them should look like. It's like specs are good or something. Wow, no one ever told me. You're probably wondering, like, what makes the actual magic happen? What are the socket things that I keep mentioning, and what are these ports, and how is that facilitated at a lower level? And the answer to that is a lovely little library by the name of ZeroMQ. It is definitely not the topic or the concept of this talk, but it's a messaging library, and it provides a really excellent API for socket-based communication. Raise your hand if you are not a data scientist, but you write software to support data scientists. Okay, nice. Raise your hand if you've ever done low-level programming. Yeah, so low-level network programming is like a form of torture in and of itself. I think the CIA has classified it as that. And ZeroMQ really makes that easy. It's got a simple API. It's got tons of bindings across different programming languages. So I mentioned earlier you might want to write a kernel in its native language. You would use these ZeroMQ bindings available in that language to open up communication to the front end and send your messages through that. And a fun fact, the Python bindings for ZeroMQ are actually maintained by a lot of the Jupyter developers. So give them a thank you and a cupcake next time you see them for doing that. And so really the main point that I always try and drive to people during this talk is not the low level, how the message looks like or how it works, because there's documentation for that, even though nobody reads it. But it's really just a protocol. It's an agreement on how messages should be sent and how responses should be sent. And that's a really robust thing. You don't have to limit yourself to thinking about just building a kernel for a language. If you've got a special kind of DSL or querying language that you use at your company, you could build a kernel for that. You don't have to limit yourself to the standard, like I'm going to build an R kernel or I'm going to build a Julia kernel. You can get really creative because all it is a messaging protocol. Go crazy and disrupt shit is always how I like to say it. So now you've got this knowledge, you get what a kernel is, we have understanding of the Jupyter messaging protocol, we know how to pass messages back and forth, and we know all about the different sockets. The next thing that we're going to try and go through is build a kernel. And I know this is a tall order, because it seems like a really intense thing to do, and this is the part of the talk that I'm going to try and make really interactive and fun. So what I'm going to be doing is going through a Jupyter notebook that I've created already and explaining how you might go about building a Jupyter kernel using the Python subclassing technique. I've created a version of the notebook that I'm going to go through that's fill in the blank style, so it makes you run the gears in your brain a little bit, which is fun to do occasionally. It's located at this link if you want to check it out. I'm going to give everyone the chance to take a picture or open it up on their machine. And I'm going to go ahead and switch to mirroring my display right now so I can go through this notebook with you guys. So are you guys seeing my display? Yes, you are. So I'm going to go ahead and open up. Is that good size? No, it's not. It's too small. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the existing notebook that I've written for this. And you can find it online. This is basically what you have there, but it's filled out, completed. And what I've based this off is a bash kernel that was developed by a Jupyter developer named Thomas. And what I've done is kind of broken up that code and gone through it. And we're just going to go through each of the steps that are shown in this code and kind of like do a walkthrough. It'll be super fun. Who's feeling tired? It's okay if you are. I understand it's late afternoon. It's like everyone's feeling dead. Can you guys engage in an experiment with me? Yeah. Okay. Everyone stand up. Let's go. Yes. Now you're going to put your hands up all the way to the top and try and reach all the way up. Yes. Come on, try really hard. Both hands. Yes. And then you're going to gently bring them down slowly. Try not to slap the person next to you, although that's okay. They won't sue. And then you're just gonna like shake your hips a little bit and loosen it out. Yeah, just do a little dance in your seat, you know, get it going. All right, now you can sit down. Do you feel like more energized now and ready for the second half of the talk? Yeah. So this is gonna be a super quick walkthrough. It will be linked in my Twitter after this talk is done. The question was, where can I find this notebook? So I'm going to tweet out the link once this talk is done. So be sure to follow me on Twitter for the link and for like really funny jokes. Yes. And also just come up to me afterwards and I can show you the slide again. So, all right, we're sitting here. We've learned all this stuff from Safia about like Jupyter kernels and like our brain is stuffed and full. And we want to start to build our own. We've got Python 3 installed. We've got Jupyter installed already because we've been using it in our day-to-day job or just playing around with it. And we want to take it to the next level. So we're going to open up our text editor, Vim, Emacs, Atom, a stone tablet from the 21st century. That's just an iPad. I said the wrong thing and then the joke just went south. So to start off, you're going to import the base kernel class, which is stored in the IPyKernel module. That kernel, if you've ever had to install a Jupyter kernel before, you like have to type in IPyKernel into the command line to install it. So it's exposed as a shell command, but also as a module that you can use, which contains the kernel base class. So that's kernel right there. And once you've imported that base class, you can start to use it for all the fun stuff. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a bash kernel class that's going to subclass the kernel that we just created. Can everyone see the screen all right? Is it zoomed in well? I forgot, I should have asked that earlier. I was just so excited to make you guys stretch and shake your hips and stuff. And then inside this bash kernel class, you're going to need to specify a couple of different variables. These include variables that describe the language that your kernel is in, as well as the language version, as well as the implementation of the kernel itself. So this is my bash kernel, and it's the first version I made last night at 11 p.m. because I definitely don't procrastinate, promise. There's this fun banner variable, which when I first discovered it, I was like, what does this do? And you have to like look a lot in the documentation to find it out. The banner is what is printed out when somebody starts your kernel in console mode. So if they're not connecting to it via a notebook front end, they're connecting to it via console front end, the banner is going to be printed the first thing. So if you're like building something internally inside your company, you might want to like print out, you know, license information or warnings about use or all that fun stuff. So the banner is a good thing to know. Keep a close eye as I go through these things because in the link that I shared with you previously, there's a lot of fill in the blanks. So if you want to take notes and like cheat to figure out what you need to fill in the blanks with, that's fine too. And then you're going to need to add another parameter or attribute to your new kernel class, and that's something called language info. Language info, I'm going to ask a quick question to the audience to see how curious you guys are. Raise your hand if you've looked at the raw JSON for your notebook, if you've opened a notebook file in a text editor or Vim or something like that. Yeah, and if you scroll through it and you see this language info key. The language info key contains the exact information that you specify here in your kernel. And this is really useful for a couple of things. You'll notice here we've got a code mirror mode key inside our language info dictionary. This is used by the front end to determine what kind of syntax highlighting it should use. So in this case, we're telling it to use shell-based syntax highlighting on the front end, which is like a good thing to have if you want people to enjoy using your kernel. It also specifies things like the file extension, which links into when you export a file from a Jupyter Notebook instance. It'll add in that file extension at the end, .sh. So this is a useful thing to know. It might be blank in the notebook that I shared with you, so this is a good way to cheat on your homework. I'm such a great teacher. So once we've created sort of these basic attributes that need to be exposed in our kernel, we're going to jump in and instantiate the kernel itself. There's a couple of things going on in our instantiation for the bash kernel here. And it sounds overwhelming, but I'm going to try and put it in a very simple way. To start off, we're going to call the initialization function in our parent class, the kernel class. And this is going to take care of instantiating things like the execution count. The execution count is that little number you see on the side of all your Jupyter cells that changes as you run them, or clears and all that. And then it's going to make a call to another function that's called start bash. And this function instantiates a connection via pexpect to a bash REPL. And we store that connection in a variable called bash wrapper. You can do this with other tools as well. I mentioned earlier, if you want to build a Ruby kernel, you might instantiate a connection to a IRB or an interactive Ruby session to start off this back and forth. So this is how we initialize our kernel. And then what's really great about the subclassing technique is that there's really only one function that you have to fill in or code up in order to get your kernel working, and that's the doExecute function. And the doExecute function has got a lot going on, but it's responsible for handling, believe it or not, another thing in computer science that's named well, what the kernel should do when it sent a request to execute a piece of code. And it's a function that takes in a couple of parameters. These parameters include the code that it needs to execute. There's a parameter called silent, which describes whether or not it should suppress output. There's another parameter called store history, which defines whether or not it should update the execution count. There's an allow standard input, which says, is this execution request allowed to request input from the front end? And you can configure these to your liking based on what kind of functionality you want your kernel to have. And then really in the bulk of the doExecute function, you're going to have a lot of your logic. So the first thing you might think of is maybe I have a sneaky user and they request to execute an empty cell. And you don't really want to do anything if they haven't sent you any code to execute. So, you might check, have they sent me any code using this simple if statement in Python? And if so, you're going to return back a JSON payload, because remember, all of this is JSON. And that JSON payload is going to specify that it was in OK status, like nothing broke, no errors occurred, Trump was not elected president, the ice caps did not completely melt, it was mostly fine. It's going to maintain the execution count. And it's going to send back an empty payload and an empty user expression dict. So this is kind of like you asked me to do nothing, I did nothing, here's just everything's okay. And you're sending that back to the front end. Now, let's say that they do have a valid command that they want you to interpret. Well, one thing that you're going to want to do is send that command over to the bash wrapper that we created earlier and request that that command be run, and you're going to store the result of that command in this output variable. And you want to keep track of a couple of different things since this is a bash kernel. Let's say that like they decided to like do cat on a 1,000,000-line long file and they instantly regretted it and they're like pressing Control-C to get out of the command. You want to be able to detect that keyboard interrupt and appropriately send an interrupt signal to the bash REPL and then change the variable appropriately. Now, similarly, imagine like they truly panicked, like they accidentally ran that shell script that they like built when they were 10 and just getting into programming that like overloads your disk with null data and just tears everything, and they're like panicking and pressing Control-D, which sends an end of file signal, and you just want to restart the entire kernel and all of that. You can do that here in this final except. So restart the bash session and reinstantiate the wrapper that you have around bash. So this kind of takes care of executing a valid command or code, and then all of the other things the user might send unexpectedly. Now, we mentioned earlier that you can send back outputs using the IO pub socket, which is super handy. And you'll notice that it's referenced here in the send response function that we're making a call to. So essentially here you're saying if the user hasn't requested that output needs to be suppressed, we're gonna go ahead and send back a simple text of whatever was catted out. So, you know, if it's like their silly like ASCII art or what have you, it's going to be sent back via the IO pub socket. And if they haven't actually executed anything, if they've requested that the kernel be interrupted, earlier we had sent the interrupt kernel and we'd kind of set a Boolean. In addition to doing that, we want to make sure that the front end knows that we recognized and accepted their request to interrupt the current session. And to do that, we're going to send back a simple payload and change the status so that the front end is aware. So notice it's pretty much standard syntax or standard payload for everything. You're just kind of changing what message you're sending. And another thing that you might want to check for is if something has errored out, which is terrible for the user, but also something they should know about. So one way to do that is to request that the shell execute a simple command and see if it can do this okay. Like, if it's fine to try and execute this echo command and no exceptions are raised, then we know that it doesn't need to exit abruptly and we don't have to send back an error to the user. Once again, the error is just a JSON message that you send back to the user. And then finally, if everything is okay, you're basically going to send a simple payload that says, you know, the status is okay, here's the execution count, a payload, and the result of user expressions. And this is what do execute looks like for our bash wrapper. And I broke it down earlier, and as you go through the notebook yourself in your spare time, you'll be able to see it much better. It seems like a lot, right? It's like a really long function, like this is bad programming, you should break it up into separate functions. But this takes care of all of the edge cases and potential uses for that kernel. So you take care of when you're not getting a message, you take care of when you're requesting it be interrupted, you take care of errors, all of that good stuff. So when you're building kernels for other languages, this is where a bunch of the work happens. And you can use a similar template if you'd like. As you start to build your own kernels, just kind of follow along with what I have, but instead of bash wrapper and using like an echo command to test for errors, you might use the language-specific functionality that you're using. So that's our do execute function. But Jupyter and all of the other notebooks do so much more than just execute code cells. So you've got like lots of cool functionality that I talked about earlier. You've got tab complete, you can check if something's complete, like all sorts of cool stuff. The kernel base class only requires that you override do execute, like you don't have to worry about anything else, but if you want it to be like super fancy, you can write a do complete function that handles tab completion, which I would do, but then that would just take too long. And also I did this at midnight last night, so yeah, definitely not a procrastinator. But this is really kind of the most basic, simplest kernel that you can create. It specifies its implementation and the language it needs. It specifies the kind of backend that's supporting it. And then it specifies how it executes code. And once you've got this done, what you go on and do is install the kernel. And this is usually done by specifying what's known as a kernel spec, which is a file that explains how you would launch the kernel, so what commands you would run. It outlines what the name of the kernel is, so in this case it's like my bash kernel. And this is like the magic that connects what you just wrote to the way that IPython or Jupyter, new name, branding everybody, gotta stay on brand, or Jupyter launches kernels. And so all of these things are connected together. So you've got a front end, you've got a messaging protocol that manages how messages are sent back and forth, and you've got the kernel itself, which could be either written as a Python wrapper or in the native language, which is like super fun to do. Does everyone feel comfortable and understand that, or feel like they can go back and read through this notebook and kind of get a grasp of it? Did I enlighten you today? Good. Awesome. So I'm going to jump back to my presentation really quickly. Technical difficulties, potentially? No. So once again, if you want to go through and fill out the empty notebook for this lesson, it's available at this link. Just go check it out, download it, play around with it. Once again, I'm Captain Safia on Twitter and GitHub if you'd like to see my open source work or like what I do. If you have questions, but you're too nervous to ask in a public venue, feel free to email me at safia@safia.rocks, and I will try and respond soon. Like once I'm done with the playlist of cat videos I have to get through, I'll get to the emails I have to go through. But yes, that was my talk. I hope everybody enjoyed it. I will be around today and the rest of the conference to answer any of your questions and any of your feedback. And I'm going to unplug and give it to the next speaker. Thank you, everybody.